One morning in January 1945, a 10-year-old girl named Eva Moses Kaur broke the ice on the surface of the Solar River with her hands. She had been without drinking water for days. When she looked up from the snowy bank, she saw another girl on the other side of the river, well-dressed with braided hair and colored ribbons, carrying a school backpack. Eva stood staring at her in silence. It was, according to her own words, the first moment she remembered that a world existed beyond those walls, a world where children went to school, a world where clothes were not full of lice, a world where no one expected to die that afternoon.
At that moment, another Nazi came, pulled my mother to the right, we were pulled to the left, we were crying, she was crying. And all I ever remember is seeing my mother's arms stretched out in despair as she was pulled away. I never even said goodbye to her, but I did not understand that this would be the last time that we would see her.
What happened to Auschwitz after the war is not an epilogue. It was another chapter of horror, of impunity, of betrayal, and of memory. The executioners fled. The survivors returned to their towns and found the doors closed. Justice arrived late, poorly, and for very few. The camp remained as ruins in the snow, desecrated by neighbors searching for gold among the bones. And the world took decades to decide what to do with that place, the largest cemetery in human history. On January 17, 1945, the last count in the main camps of the Auschwitz complex registered 66,022 prisoners. The following day, that figure would begin to vanish. The Soviet Vistula Oder offensive was advancing with a speed that no one in Berlin had foreseen. The divisions of the First Ukrainian Front were crossing the Nida River on January 12th. On the 17th, they were less than 60 kilometers away. At the headquarters of the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps in Berlin-Oranienburg, the order arrived: evacuate. But before evacuating, erase. Heinrich Himmler had already ordered the cessation of executions in the gas chambers at the end of November 1944, a verbal order without paper. Shortly thereafter, a demolition commando began to dismantle crematoria 2 and 3 in Birkenau, the most modern and most efficient. In those structures, throughout 1944, hundreds of thousands of bodies had burned. In mid-January 1945, what remained of them were half-empty concrete structures, the furnace rails removed, the metal objects packed, asphalted carcasses in the snow. On January 20th at 12 noon, an SS detachment detonated what was left of crematoria 2 and 3. The explosions shook the earth miles away. Black smoke rose into a grey winter sky. There was no time to remove the debris, so the partially destroyed walls, the flooded basements, the underground changing rooms remained as they were, buried under meters of snow and rubble. Crematorium 5, which had continued to operate until the last moment, burning, mind you, only the bodies of those who died in a natural manner, was dynamited at 1 in the morning on January 26th, one day before the Soviets arrived. That same January 20th, while the explosions resonated in the distance, an SS detachment went through some of the camp's dependencies and shot about 200 captive Jewish women who had been left behind. Their orders, issued by SS Obergruppenführer Schmauser, commander of the local area, were to liquidate all prisoners too weak to march, but the Soviets were advancing too fast. Most of those who remained, about 7,650 people in the main complex and in the sub-camps, survived because their executioners chose to flee instead of carrying out those orders to the end. The camp warehouses contained tons of clothing. The so-called Canada Zone, the area where stolen belongings from the deportees were sorted, still contained 348 warehouses. The SS burned some before leaving, but the main depots did not leave time to be completely destroyed. When the Soviets arrived, they found more than 800,000 items of women's clothing, thousands of men's suits, tons of human hair. Everything perfectly catalogued. With the bureaucratic meticulousness that had characterized every aspect of the operation, the evidence did not disappear. The Nazis did not have time. On January 18, 1945, before dawn, the SS guards pounded on the doors of the barracks. The prisoners who could still walk were given a few minutes to prepare. No time to gather belongings, no explanations. A quick count, the same numerical obsession until the last moment, and then the march. In rows of 5, heading west. About 65,000 prisoners left the Auschwitz complex in those first hours. Those who could not stand on their feet were shot in the barracks itself. Their bodies remained on the wooden bunks in the Polish cold of January. Outside, the temperature had dropped below 10 degrees below zero. The prisoners wore the usual striped uniform, thin fabric without insulation. Some had managed to wrap their feet with newspaper pages inside their wooden clogs. Most had no more than that. Franz Wunsch, an SS man who had developed a forbidden affair with the prisoner Helena Citronova, made one last concession before leaving for the front. He brought her and her sister 2 pairs of fur-lined boots. It was the only gesture of humanity remembered among thousands of brutalities. Helena took the boots, but threw away the note with the address of Wunsch's mother. Her father's words resonated louder. "Do not forget who you are." Helena and her sister began the march. She described the first days as inhumanly hard. Around them, people fell into the snow. There was no strength to continue. They fell, and they did not get up again. Everyone thought of themselves. Total chaos. Whoever lived, lived. Whoever died, died. Ibi Man, a 19-year-old girl who arrived from Czechoslovakia the previous year, was taken out to the march in the middle of the night. "They gathered us at midnight, and we never knew the hour or the moment. We were disconnected from the world." Despite the sound of Soviet artillery, the SS insisted on counting the prisoners before starting. Whoever bent over, whoever stopped for a second, was shot. Ibi marched alongside her sister. When Ibi said she could go no further, her sister dragged her. They slept in barns, once in a pigsty. They passed by ditches filled with bodies. The snow turned into mud that soaked their shoes and raised blisters that there was no way to heal. There were 2 main evacuation routes from the Auschwitz complex. The first led northwest, passing through Mikołów to the Gleibitz railway station, about 50 kilometers. The second went directly west, toward the Wodzisław station, in what the Germans called Loslau, about 65 kilometers. Upon reaching those stations, the survivors were pushed into open cargo wagons that in some cases contained up to half a meter of accumulated snow. The prisoners crowded so tightly that there was no room to sit. Morris Venezia, who had been a member of the Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers, secured a place to sit in one of those wagons. He remembers the intense cold, the snow falling upon him, the constant need to throw bodies out of the wagon as those around him yielded to the conditions. He also relates how he and several companions deliberately drowned a German prisoner who refused to give up his place after an agreement bargained with cigarettes. Venezia feels no remorse for it. "I was glad to kill a German. They killed my whole family, 30 or 40 people, and I killed one. What is that? If I could have killed 100, I would have been glad." That account, naked, without adornments of heroism or guilt, says something about what the machinery of Auschwitz had done to moral categories. The camp did not only murder its victims, it also stripped them of the luxury of being judged by the standards of those who were never inside that world. The destination for some 20,000 of the evacuees from Auschwitz was the Bergen-Belsen camp in Lower Saxony. At the end of 1944, Bergen-Belsen had about 15,000 inmates. In April 1945, when the British arrived, there were 60,000. Many of them were survivors of the Auschwitz death marches. The images that the British soldiers filmed there on April 15, 1945, would go around the world, walking skeletons, piles of corpses, children with sunken eyes. What those images did not show was that Bergen-Belsen had not been designed as an extermination camp. It had become that hell precisely because the system was collapsing and nobody was feeding anybody. Alice Locke-Kahana and her sister Edith arrived at Bergen-Belsen after Auschwitz. Alice thought Auschwitz was the limit of what a human being could endure. Bergen-Belsen was worse. There were no bunks. There was no water. There was a typhus epidemic. The barracks were half-built. At night, a woman near them would lose her mind and trample them while they slept. "There is no vocabulary that can tell what Bergen-Belsen was," Alice said. Every night they heard the same cry, "Water, mother! Water, mother!" On April 15th, someone shouted, "Liberated!" Alice jumped from her place and ran out. "What is liberation? I have to find it before it melts." She found Allied soldiers in jeeps, but Edith was already too ill. They took her to a military hospital. Alice wanted to go with her. The soldier lowered her from the vehicle. Alice walked back the next day, but Edith had already gone in an ambulance to another hospital. Alice searched for her sister for 53 years. In the Bergen-Belsen records, she finally found that Edith Schwartz, her mother's maiden name used as camouflage, died on June 2, 1945, weeks after liberation. Liberation arrived too late. On January 27, 1945, in the early afternoon, units of the 1st Ukrainian Front of the Red Army arrived at the Auschwitz complex. Lieutenant Ivan Martinushkin commanded a mortar company that had fought its way into the interior of the town. When he reached Birkenau a few hours after liberation, he found a strange calm. The prisoners who remained, around 6,000 in Birkenau, slightly more than 1,000 in the main camp, and about 600 in the Monowitz labor camp, looked at him with what he described as gratitude in their eyes and forced smiles. "We had the feeling that we had done something good," he said, "something very good, that we had fulfilled our duty." But he was not deeply moved. He had been in continuous combat for more than a year. He had seen smaller prisoner camps. He had seen razed villages, mutilated children. For him, Auschwitz was one more horror in a war that already overflowed with horrors. Eva Moses Kaur and her sister Miriam heard a woman in the barracks scream, "We are free! We are free! We are free!" Eva ran to the door. She saw nothing in the snow. Time passed until she distinguished figures in white camouflage coats, Soviet soldiers. They approached them. "They hugged us and gave us cookies and chocolate," she remembered. Being alone like that, a hug meant more than anyone can imagine. "We were hungry not only for food, but for human kindness." That hug, the first non-violent physical contact in months for many of them, remained engraved in the memory of those who survived. But the news of the liberation was not at that moment a front-page event in the Western world. The Soviet newspaper Pravda published the account of its correspondent Boris Polovoy on February 23rd. The Jewish Chronicle of London picked it up a few days later, but the liberation of Auschwitz did not have the immediate impact that might be expected, in part because there were other stories competing. The Conference of the Big Three in Yalta, the advances on the Western Front, in part also because the Red Army was the one that had found the camp, and the first fissures of the alliance that had won the war were already beginning. Polovoy's article in Pravda already showed the traces of an interpretation that would become official Soviet policy for decades. The victims of Auschwitz were described collectively as victims of fascism, without distinction of who had died there or why. The Jews, 90% of those murdered, were made invisible within that generic category. The camp, in the Soviet narrative, was the crime of capitalism against the workers. The uniqueness of the extermination of the Jews as a deliberate ideological project was erased. That omission was not an oversight, it was policy. The Soviets filmed material in the first days. They documented the piles of clothing, the children's shoes, the tufts of hair. The images were real, but the narrative constructed around them during decades of the Cold War silenced the central component of what had happened in that place. Liberation was not the end of the story for those who survived. It was, in many cases, the beginning of another catastrophe. Helena Chitronova and her sister wandered for months through a liberated Germany, mixing with the flows of German refugees escaping westward. They slept in barns or in bombed houses. They obtained food where they could. Soon they ran into soldiers of the Red Army, and the Soviet soldiers did not behave like liberators. They were drunk, completely drunk, Helena remembered. They were wild animals. The soldiers looked for women in the places where the refugees slept. Helena would hide under her sister, 10 years older than her, in the hope that the soldiers would not choose them. The strategy worked for her, but she heard everything they did to others. Screams until they fell silent and no longer had strength. There were cases where they raped them to death. They strangled them. One morning, Helena went out for a bicycle ride. She found an abandoned wine cellar and stopped to rest. A Soviet soldier arrived on a motorcycle. He attacked her. She fought, bit, kicked, screamed. The soldier asked her if she was German. "No, I am Jewish, from the camp," she said, showing him the number tattooed on her arm. The man stopped, backed away, left. Perhaps he was Jewish, perhaps not. She never knew. Tatiana Nanieva was a Soviet nurse who had been captured by the Germans in 1942 when the hospital where she worked was encircled. She spent 2.5 years as a prisoner. In January 1945, she heard the soldiers of the Red Army arrive with great pomp, singing patriotic songs with their heads held high, her heart filled with joy. She yearned for her land, her family. Then 2 officers approached her. One was drunk. He screamed at her, "So how did you spend it here, whores?" Tatiana ran and hid. When the frontline soldiers left, the charge against her remained standing. Treason to the motherland. For the crime of letting herself be captured, she was sentenced to 6 years in a labor camp in Siberia and lifetime exile. Pavel Stenkin had been one of the 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war sent in October 1941 to Auschwitz to build the Birkenau camp. By the following spring, of those 10,000, only a few hundred remained. Stenkin managed to escape to the forest and eventually join the advancing Red Army. Instead of being received as a hero, he was interrogated for weeks. The standard question from the Smersh investigators was always the same. When did you join the German army? Stenkin was sent to internal exile in Perm, a closed city in the Urals. The interrogations continued. They accused him of espionage. They promised him amnesty if he signed confessions for crimes he had not committed. Only in 1953, with the death of Stalin, was he released. He was one of more than 1 million Soviet soldiers who were prisoners twice, once of the Germans, another of their own compatriots. Linda Breda had been in Auschwitz for 2.5 years when she was liberated on May 5, 1945, from a camp north of Berlin. The Soviet soldiers were kind to her. They helped her find new clothes. They took her to a nearby German house and told her she could take whatever she needed. The woman of the house began to scream, "No SS! No SS!" as the prisoners entered. Upon opening the wardrobe, they found SS uniforms. Linda took what she could. Months later, after an endless journey through a shattered Europe, without trains, without passable roads, with Soviet soldiers who at one point stole even the clothes they themselves had stolen from the Germans, Linda arrived at her hometown in eastern Slovakia, Stropkov. She stood in front of the door of her house. Someone opened. A man, perhaps Russian or Ukrainian. "What do you want?" "I have returned home. Go back to where you came from," and he closed the door. Linda walked down the main street of her town. The houses that had belonged to her Jewish friends and relatives were occupied by people who arrived with the Soviets. Her lifelong neighbors looked at her from afar. None approached. I had the feeling that all eyes were looking at me through the windows. The next day she left. She never returned. She ended up emigrating to California. Walter Fried, 17 years old, also returned to his hometown, Topolkany, in Slovakia. Of the 3,200 Jews who had lived in that city before the war, only around 10% returned. The Fried family found their apartment occupied, also their restaurant, nationalized under the new Soviet administration. They went to visit the Christian friends to whom his father had entrusted gold, jewelry, and money before deportation. The lunch was tense. When Walter's father brought up the subject, his friends said that what was kept was only a few items of clothing. "We gave you gold and diamonds," Walter's father pleaded. It was useless. Weeks later, Walter and his father were walking down a main street when a group of about 30 young men lunged at them. Among them was Josho, an old school friend of Walter. Josho beat them while screaming, "Jew, you are a Jew!" Walter, lying on the ground, remembered that he had shared his bread with Josho at school. "Was it not enough that you ate my bread? Now you come to beat me?" Josho did not answer. He only repeated, "Jew, you are a Jew." The mob beat them with sticks until they were badly wounded, on the main street in broad daylight, while people passed and nobody intervened. They dragged them to the police station. The police, instead of detaining the aggressors, gave them another beating. Walter emigrated to Israel as soon as he could. The Danish Jews had a radically different experience. When they returned, most from exile in Sweden, a few from the Theresienstadt camp, they found their homes intact. Their landlords had kept their furniture. Their neighbors had paid the rent. "Nothing here was touched," said Bent Melchior. Rudy Beer's family returned to their impeccable apartment. The worst memory of their return was a raw duck that had been left in the refrigerator and which 18 months later smelled of death. Since then, his mother-in-law never ate duck again. The difference between the Danish Jews and the Slovak or Polish ones was not a matter of chance. It was structural. The countries that now lived under Soviet occupation had adopted nationalization systems that made the recovery of property impossible. Neighbors who had moved into confiscated houses could simply say they paid rent to the state. And nobody in that post-war chaos had any interest in reopening the question of what had happened while the Jews were deported. In the early morning of March 11, 1946, counterintelligence officers from the British Army surrounded a farm in Gottrupel near Flensburg in northern Germany. It was 11 o'clock at night. Inside the barn, which also served as a slaughterhouse, a man was sleeping in pajamas. It was Rudolf Höss, the first and most influential commander of Auschwitz. It had taken hard work to find him. The British had liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 and begun to systematically interrogate the survivors. Time and again, the accounts of horror pointed to the same place, a camp in Silesia called Auschwitz. The commander of that place was the target. Military intelligence knew that the best way to find a perpetrator was through his family. Höss's wife Hedwig and his children were located in a village 10 kilometers from Bergen-Belsen. They were placed under surveillance. On March 8, 1946, they detained Frau Höss. For days, she denied that her husband was alive. Finally, an officer named William Victor Cross ordered a train to be noisily shunted until it sat behind Hedwig's cell. The woman was told that this train would take her 3 children to Siberia if she did not reveal the information. They gave her paper, a pencil, and 10 minutes. She wrote it all down. When the officers arrived at the farm, a military doctor immediately searched Höss's mouth for cyanide capsules. Himmler had died that way. Höss was beaten 4 times in the face before admitting who he was. Then he was dragged to a slaughterhouse table where, according to one of the witnesses, the blows and the screams did not stop. The medical officer had to shout, "Stop, or you will return a corpse!" Höss was covered with a blanket, put into a car and carried naked across the snowy courtyard of the barracks to his cell. He was kept awake for 3 days. They jabbed him with axe handles if he showed signs of falling asleep. On March 14th, he signed an 8-page confession. Holocaust deniers point to the mistreatment suffered by Höss at the time of his arrest to discredit that confession. But Höss wrote his complete memoirs during the subsequent months in prison, memoirs that he drafted, according to his own words, with gratitude for having time to do so, and he never retracted anything from what he had confessed. He also testified at Nuremberg. In April 1947, Höss was returned to Auschwitz, to the same building where he had had his office. This time he was lodged in the cells of the basement of the Kommandantur, a few meters from the place where he had signed the death orders of more than 1 million people. The day originally scheduled for the execution, several thousand people, many survivors and relatives of victims, gathered before the enclosure. The atmosphere was tense. The pushing against the wooden fence threatened to turn into a lynching. The prisoner was not taken out of his cell. The following day, before barely a handful of witnesses, Rudolf Höss climbed the steps of the gallows. Stanisław Hans, a Polish ex-prisoner who had survived torture in the camp and was there that morning, expected a final speech, some declaration of Nazi faith. Höss did not say a word. Hans said that Höss should have been exhibited in a cage throughout Europe. But the most uncomfortable question raised by Höss's execution was whether it would have changed anything. His memoirs, completed hours before dying, reveal that he considered the extermination of the Jews a tactical error because it had generated hatred against Germany. Not a crime, a miscalculation. It was the most he could bring himself to acknowledge. Josef Mengele was another matter completely different. On January 18, 1945, when the evacuation of Auschwitz began, Mengele left with the documents of his research under his arm. Along with other doctors, he fled to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp and from there, dressed in a Wehrmacht officer's uniform, toward Czechoslovakia. In May, he joined a motorized field hospital. He crossed the border into Saxony. In July, he was captured by American forces and taken to a prisoner camp in Weiden, Bavaria. He was transferred to Ingolstadt. His name was known by his captors. But the special intelligence units that sought war criminals did not visit either of those 2 camps. One day, Mengele simply walked away. He found refuge under the false name of Fritz Hollmann on the farm of Georg and Maria Fischer, where he worked as a farmhand. In the summer of 1949, with money from his family and support from the Edelweiss Group, a network of ex-Nazi officers in the Tyrol, Mengele obtained a blank International Red Cross travel document. He wrote the name of Helmut Gregor, born on August 11, 1911, in Tyrol, by profession a technician. Using the route of the monasteries through Italy, he arrived in Argentina, where dozens of ex-Nazis had found refuge thanks to the policy of President Juan Perón. In Buenos Aires, he exchanged the Red Cross document for an Argentine identity paper under the number 394048. He used it until 1957 while working openly as a doctor. He felt so secure that in 1956 he traveled to Switzerland to see his son Rolf. In 1958, he became a co-owner of a pharmaceutical company called Fadro Farm under his real name. He paid 1 million pesos for his share. He married the widow of his brother Carl in Uruguay. He was a rich and prominent man in the German expatriate community in Buenos Aires. It was not until 1959 that the German judiciary issued an arrest warrant against him and formally requested his extradition to Argentina. In the spring of 1960, Mengele moved to Paraguay, where a former Luftwaffe ace, Hans Rudel, a personal friend of the dictator Alfredo Stroessner, helped him to obtain Paraguayan citizenship. On May 11, 1960, Israeli Mossad agents kidnapped Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. They planned to do the same with Mengele, but Mengele managed to disappear before they reached him. He went to the countryside in Paraguay, then to Brazil. He lived in small houses near Sao Paulo, changing aliases, houses, and protectors. His last years were of constant fear. A $3 million reward for his capture, the Frankfurt prosecutor's office actively searching for him, Israeli Nazi hunters following his trail. His letters to the German friends who protected him were full of anguish. He felt hounded. He knew he was alone. On February 7, 1979, while swimming in the ocean near Bertioga, Brazil, Joseph Mengele suffered a stroke. He died in the water. He was buried as Wolfgang Gerhard in the Embu Cemetery, 40 kilometers from Sao Paulo. His protectors did not inform anyone of his death for years. The search continued. Until in May 1985, an investigation in Germany led to the records of Hans Zedelmeier, an executive of the Mengele family business, and to the letters he exchanged with the Wolfgang Gerhard who lived in Brazil. On June 6, 1985, the body buried in Embu was exhumed. Anthropometric analysis, dental comparison with records from 1938, correspondences with documented war wounds. The corpse was that of Joseph Mengele. He never stepped into a courtroom. He never expressed regret. Oskar Groening, the SS non-commissioned officer who had sorted the money stolen from the deportees, handed over questionnaires in prison when the British captured him in June 1945. He wrote that he had worked for the SS Economic Administration Office in Berlin. He was sent to work in England as a prisoner of war. There he led, according to his own words, a very comfortable life. Good food, money to spend. He became a member of the YMCA choir and travelled through the Midlands and Scotland giving concerts. English families competed to have him as a guest to give him a good bed and breakfast. When he returned to Germany in 1947, he could not recover his job at the bank. His past in the SS prevented it, so he found work in a glass factory and began to rise. In time, he became head of personnel and later an honorary judge in industrial tribunals. Without apparent irony, Groening believed that his experience in the SS and the Hitler Youth had taught him discipline, which had made him a better professional. One day, at his philately club, a person spoke to him about a publication that proved that the gas used in Auschwitz would have killed every living being in an enormous radius, that it was impossible for it to have happened as it was said. Groening said nothing that day, but later he wrote his own ironic comments on the pamphlet and mailed them to the man. From then on, he began to receive anonymous calls from deniers. 90% of his letters arrived from people telling him that what he himself had seen with his eyes was a hallucination. It was that denial campaign that pushed Groening decades later to speak publicly about his experience. His message was simple: I would like you to believe me. I saw the gas chambers, I saw the crematorium, I saw the fires in the crematorium, I saw the fires in the open air. I was on the ramp during the selections. I would like you to believe that these atrocities occurred because I was there. The figure is stark. Of the approximately 6,500 SS members who served in Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, and who are estimated to have survived the war, only about 750 received some type of sentence. Around 85% escaped without legal consequences of any kind. It was not for lack of evidence. The camp was full of records. The bureaucratic documents of the SS themselves, the delivery notes for the furnaces, the minutes of meetings with IG Farben, the reports to the Reichsführer SS, were found when the Soviets arrived. Survivors could name their executioners by first and last name. The problem was another. The first serious judicial actions were undertaken by Poland. Thanks to the work of the Polish military mission and the Warsaw government, at least 1,000 ex-members of the Auschwitz SS were extradited to Poland between 1946 and 1948. In March 1947, the Supreme National Tribunal tried Höss in Warsaw. From November to December 1947 in Krakow, another 40 members of the camp's SS were tried. Höss and 23 defendants in the Krakow trial received death sentences. 2 were pardoned later, 6 received life imprisonment, 7 were sentenced to 15 years, 3 to 10, 5 and 3 years respectively. 1 was acquitted. The Polish district courts prosecuted another 602 people related to the camp. But the rushed pace of the proceedings produced manifest errors. Someone like SS Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Berger, head of the Administration Economy Department, one of the most important cogs in the exploitation system, spent only 5 years in a Polish prison before being released. SS Hauptscharführer Bernhard Walter, the head of the Criminal Identification Department, who admitted to having personally executed several hundred people at the Wall of Death in the courtyard of Block 11, received 3 years. With the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, jurisdiction over German defendants passed to the German judicial system. And there, for years, the will to prosecute the crimes of Auschwitz was scarce. The Cold War had changed priorities. Ex-Nazis with technical and administrative skills were useful for rebuilding the country. Nobody wanted to stir up the past with too much enthusiasm. It was Fritz Bauer, Attorney General of the state of Hesse, who forced the change. Bauer was Jewish, a survivor of exile, and had an obsession that Germany look at what it had done. It was he who in 1952 provided information to the Israeli government about Eichmann's whereabouts in Argentina. And it was he who, beginning in 1958, set up the investigation that would lead to the largest trial on Auschwitz held in Germany. The first Frankfurt trial began on December 20th, 1963, and concluded on August 20th, 1965. 183 days of sessions, 319 witnesses, 430 hours of testimony. It was at that time the longest judicial process in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. The 22 defendants were mid- and low-ranking officials, 2 adjutants of the commander, 5 officials of the political department, a Lagerführer of Auschwitz, one with 4 of his collaborators from Department 3, an official from Department 4, 8 employees from Department 5, doctors and medical orderlies, and an ex-prisoner with official functions. The result was disappointing for those who expected forceful convictions. 6 defendants, including the ex-prisoner with official functions, received life imprisonment. 11 received sentences of between 3 and 20 years. 2 cases were dismissed due to illness, 3 acquitted. The underlying problem was structural. German law required proof of specific individual acts. Belonging to the system was not enough. Proving that someone had pulled a trigger, pushed someone into a gas chamber, given an injection of phenol, required direct witnesses to that concrete act. The defendants denied everything with the same litany. They were not present when such a thing happened. They never gave that order. Someone else must have done it. The defense of just following orders operated de facto as a partial shield. In the Bergen-Belsen trials of 1945, held before a British military tribunal, some ex-members of the Auschwitz SS were sentenced to death for crimes committed in that other camp, not in Auschwitz. Josef Kramer, who had been Höss's adjutant, died executed for Bergen-Belsen. Franz Hössler, Lagerführer in Birkenau as well, Irma Grazer, an SS guard, and Elisabeth Volkenrath, superintendent of the SS women, all for Bergen-Belsen, not for Auschwitz. SS Brigade Führer Karl Klauberg, who had performed sterilization experiments on women in Block 10 of Auschwitz, was arrested by the Soviets at the end of the war, tried in the USSR in 1948, and sentenced to 25 years. He was repatriated to Germany in 1955. For a time he practiced medicine under his real name and boasted of his academic achievements. He was detained again, but died in 1957 in Kiel while awaiting trial. The last commander of Auschwitz, SS Sturmbannführer Richard Baer, was identified and arrested in 1960. He died in 1963 during the preparations for the Frankfurt trial. He did not reach the dock. In Austria, 2 members of the construction management of Auschwitz, Walter de Hacco and Fritz Ertl, the architects of the crematoria, were tried in Vienna in January 1972. Both were acquitted. In the global balance of the approximately 6,500 ex-members of the Auschwitz SS who are estimated to have survived the war, only around 10% stood before a court. And of those, effective convictions were the exception, not the rule. Impunity was not accidental. It was the product of political priorities, of absent institutional wills, of a legal system that was not designed to process crimes of that scale, and of a society that in many cases preferred not to know. While the courts moved slowly or did not move at all, some Jewish survivors and veterans decided to act on their own. Moshe Tavor was 20 years old in 1941 when he joined the British Army and was assigned to the Jewish Brigade, a unit of 5,000 Jewish soldiers under the command of Canadian Brigadier Ernest Benjamin. Their emblem was the Star of David, today the flag of the State of Israel. As the brigade advanced through northern Italy and the extent of the Holocaust began to be known, Tavor and his companions made a decision. It was not enough to have fought in the war. Something more had to be done. They obtained, through contacts in the intelligence services and in Jewish organizations, lists of Germans suspected of having participated in the extermination. They camouflaged their vehicles with markings of non-Jewish units. They put British military police brassards on their arms. They arrived at the houses of the suspects. They were not suspicious, Tavor said, because they did not know we were the Jewish Brigade. They thought we were British soldiers. We would take that man, and from that moment he never saw his home again. They took the suspect to an isolated place. They presented the charges to him. Perhaps we gave him the opportunity to say a few words. And then they executed him. The method was strangulation, so as not to leave blood. Afterward, they tied something heavy to the feet of the body and threw it into a river. Tavor calculated having participated personally in about 5 executions. He estimated that the brigade as a whole had carried out about 20. He has no doubts about it. When I did it, I felt very good. Not at the moment of killing, but during that period. I cannot say that I feel bad about it now. You can tell me that I murdered people, but I know whom I killed. He acknowledged also that the evidence on which they based themselves could have been at times little more than rumors, that probably some innocent people died, and that there were members of the brigade who killed Germans completely spontaneously without information of any kind, just for the fact of being Germans. There was a man on a bicycle. The driver simply ran him over. The motivation was not only revenge. It was also a reaction to something that perturbed him deeply, the feeling that the victims had gone to the slaughter like sheep. Tavor, raised in the militaristic culture of Judaism in Palestine, did not understand how hundreds of people could let themselves be led by a few soldiers. If there was a lesson to be drawn from the extermination of the Jews of Europe, it was that never again should they submit without resistance. That conviction, along with that of their own territory and their own army, would become one of the foundational pillars of the nascent state of Israel. Other survivors formed more organized groups. The most well-known was the Nakam, revenge in Hebrew, led by Abba Kovner, poet and partisan. Kovner planned something of a scale difficult to imagine, poisoning the water supply of several German cities. The plan was eventually aborted. But an alternative project did get executed. The poisoning of bread rations destined for ex-members of the SS interned in a prisoner camp in Stalag 13 near Nuremberg in April 1946. More than 2,200 people became ill. Few or none died. The exact data are uncertain. Kovner was detained by the British when he was returning from Europe with materials for the poison of the water supply, but the direct connection with the poisoning of the bread was never legally proven. In parallel, the Israeli Mossad executed the operation of greatest political impact, the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires on May 11, 1960. Eichmann was clandestinely transferred to Israel and tried in Tel Aviv in 1961. The trial sessions were broadcast by television all over the world, something unthinkable in the Frankfurt process. The trial of Eichmann did something that no previous process had achieved. It put the Holocaust at the center of the global consciousness, forced Germany to confront its history, and gave the survivors a stage where their testimonies were heard and documented before the entire world. Eichmann was condemned to death and executed in the early morning of May 31, 1962, in the Ramla prison. It was the only civil execution carried out in the history of the State of Israel. In 1947, while Höss climbed to the gallows in the courtyard of the camp he had built, the structures of Birkenau were collapsing at an accelerated pace. The Polish neighbors of the area began to dismantle the wooden barracks of Birkenau to repair their own houses, destroyed during the war years and the Nazi reorganization of the territory. It was a pragmatic looting driven by misery. Wood was wood, tiles were tiles. Józefa Zielinska, a Polish teenager who had returned to Auschwitz after the war and found nowhere to live, had to settle in a shed that before had been a chicken coop. To earn some money, she and her friends went to the site of the destroyed crematoria in Birkenau and searched for gold. They turned over the earth. They sifted the bone fragments with water. "Everyone felt bad doing it," she said. "Whether they had family who had died in the camp or not, everyone felt uncomfortable because they were human bones, after all. It was not a pleasure. But poverty forced us." With the money obtained selling the gold they found in the ground of Birkenau, Józefa's family was able to buy a cow. Jan Piłczyk, another Pole who lived in a nearby chicken coop, also admitted having searched for objects of value among the debris. He found a gold tooth, a Jewish coin, a gold bracelet. "Today I wouldn't do it, right? I wouldn't disturb human bones because I know it is a sacrilege. But then circumstances forced us." When he was not searching for objects, Jan bribed the Soviet soldiers who occasionally patrolled in order to be able to take wood from the barracks and build his own house. Stanisław Hans, the Polish ex-political prisoner who had been a witness to the execution of Höss, got a job guarding the site of Birkenau. He tried to dissuade the looters by firing into the air. He called them cemetery hyenas. He said he could recognize them in the street by the smell of bodies in fermentation. You could distinguish them as they walked. That desecration was not only material, it was also symbolic. The ground of Birkenau is a cemetery without tombstones, the largest in the world. Beneath it, mixed with the earth, are the ashes of hundreds of thousands of people. The SS, in the final months of the camp, had ordered groups of captive women to exhume the mass graves, burn the bodies in open-air pyres, crush the bones, and pour the ashes into the Vistula River. The objective was to erase the evidence. But the scale of the crimes was too large to erase them completely. There was earth impregnated with bone over square kilometers, and in the years of immediate post-war, that earth was turned over to search for the gold that the victims' teeth might contain. Nor did the Polish state, under communist administration since 1944, have a particular interest in preserving the memory of Auschwitz as what it had been, the place of the extermination of the Jewish people. The official narrative preferred the Soviet formula: victims of fascism, Polish martyrs, workers crushed by capitalism. The Jewish specificity was uncomfortable, politically inconvenient. The first permanent exhibition installed in Block 11 of the main camp included for decades a sign indicating that 4 million victims had died in Auschwitz. The figure was Soviet, politically inflated, and hid that more than 90% of the dead were Jews. The sign was not removed until the 90s. On July 2, 1947, the Polish parliament approved a law that turned the site of Auschwitz into a state museum. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum opened its doors that same year, driven in part by the initiative of some of its own survivors. The decision was notable in its speed. Barely 2 years after the end of the war, when Europe remained in ruins and the world still processed the enormity of what had occurred, Poland decided to preserve the site. The motivation was double: to honor the victims and to ensure that the crime remained documented. But the tensions over what story to tell, the Jewish, the Polish, the Soviet, the Universal, did not take long to emerge. The main camp, Auschwitz I, became the center of the museum. Its facilities, the Kommandanta building, the brick barracks, Block 11 where executions were carried out, the Wall of Death, the gallows where the 4 women who had supplied explosives for the Sonderkommando rebellion were hanged, were relatively intact. Crematorium 1, the first to operate, had been partially modified by the Nazis in 1943 to convert it into an air raid shelter. After the war, the Poles restored it to show it to the public, which later would generate controversy among historians. Birkenau, 3 kilometers away, was something else. The ruins of the 4 large crematoria, dynamited in the final days, remained just as the explosions had left them. The collapsed walls, the basements flooded with cold water, the fragments of concrete scattered in the mud. Among them the objects of the crime, rails from the furnaces, metal pieces of the ventilation mechanisms. The wooden barracks, those that had not been dismantled by the neighbors, were slowly rotting. Thousands of meters of rusted barbed wire. Since 1960, the so-called System of National Exhibitions installed permanent rooms in Auschwitz I, with contributions from different countries whose citizens had died in the camp: Poland, France, Hungary, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union. Each country narrated its own history. The Soviet rooms took decades to acknowledge that the victims were principally Jews. The narrative was that of universal anti-fascism and national resistance. The German room, installed by the German Democratic Republic, was never renovated after reunification. In 1967, the first major monument was inaugurated at Birkenau, a set of stone slabs before the ruins of crematoria 2 and 3 with inscriptions in 20 languages. The original text spoke of 4 million victims, the Soviet figure, without explicitly identifying the Jews as the primary group murdered. The inscriptions were replaced in 1990 after investigations by the museum itself established with greater rigor the real number of victims, approximately 1.1 million, of whom around 1 million were Jews, and after the fall of communism eliminated the political restrictions on that narrative. In 1979, at the initiative of Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It was the first, and for years the only site of this nature on that list. The condition that Poland imposed upon entering was that the camp should symbolically represent all similar sites, that it should not be just one more among many. In 2007, at the joint instances of Poland and Israel, the official name of the inscription was changed from Auschwitz concentration camp to Auschwitz-Birkenau, German Nazi concentration and extermination camp, 1940 to 1945. The change was significant. The adjective German was deliberately added to counteract the fallacy, widespread in some international media, of calling it a Polish extermination camp. The physical liberation of the camp was not the end of Auschwitz for those who survived. The camp followed them for decades, in some cases for life. Leo Eitinger, a Norwegian doctor of Jewish origin who had been a prisoner in Auschwitz and who later became one of the leading world authorities on the psychological consequences of the Holocaust, spent years interviewing survivors in Norway and Israel. His studies documented what began to be called the concentration camp survivor syndrome. The symptoms were a cluster: memory lapses and difficulty concentrating, nervousness and irritability, chronic fatigue, sleep disturbances, headaches, emotional instability, loss of initiative, vegetative lability. But the symptoms of the syndrome, as Eitinger observed, did not tell everything. Beneath there was something more diffuse and more permanent. 80 or 90% of the Jewish survivors of Auschwitz living in Israel had lost most of their closest relatives. 3 out of 4 had lost their entire immediate family. In the Norwegian survivors, 6 of the 11 born in Norway were the only survivors of their families. The mourning that could not be done during the captivity, because mourning was a luxury that was not available because one had to keep functioning to survive, arrived later. And it arrived with all its force, with years of accumulation. For many, the liberation itself was traumatic in a different way. Primo Levi described the first moments when the Soviet soldiers arrived at Auschwitz. They did not smile, they did not greet. They were oppressed not only by compassion but by a confused shame which sealed their lips and chained their eyes to the funeral scene. That shame, the shame of the just man before the crime of another man, was also that of the survivors themselves. The shame of having survived when others did not, the unanswered question of why them and not the others. Levi spent the next 40 years of his life trying to articulate that experience. Each book was a return to the same central point. Auschwitz had introduced into the world something that could not be erased. It is an inexhaustible source of evil. It breaks the body and the spirit of those who sink, it crushes them and makes them abject. It returns as ignominy upon the oppressors, perpetuates itself as hatred among the survivors, and swarms in 1,000 ways against the will of everyone. Levi died on April 11, 1987, upon falling down the stairwell of his house in Turin. Doctors certified it as an accident. Many of those who knew him considered it a suicide. He himself, in interviews from his final years, had described the unbearable pressure that traumatic memories returned with greater strength in old age when the capacity to contain them diminished. 42 years after leaving Auschwitz, the psychological traces were not uniform. Many survivors rebuilt lives, families, careers. The impulse to bear witness, to tell, to ensure that the world knew, was for many of them the primary reason why they had survived or what justified having survived. Eitinger's studies showed that those who had actively mobilized coping mechanisms during captivity, making small decisions, helping others, clinging to a relationship of mutual support with another person, suffered fewer psychiatric complications in the post-war period than those who attributed their survival exclusively to chance. But even the most functional carried scars. 45 years after liberation, studies showed that those scars remained present. Traumatic memories were reactivated during serious illnesses, in old age, before any sensory trigger: the smell of smoke, the sound of a siren, a person in uniform, a tattooed number seen on another person. The second generation, the children of the survivors, was also affected in ways that psychologists began to study systematically decades later. Transmitted trauma, hypervigilance, irrational fear of separation, the silences that surrounded certain questions within families. Some families never spoke of what occurred, others could not stop speaking about it. The camp did not end at the barbed wire. Beneath the ground of Birkenau, a few meters from the ruins of the crematoria, lay manuscripts. The members of the Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and the furnaces, to remove the corpses, to crush the bones, to sort the belongings of the newly gassed, knew that sooner or later they would be liquidated. The SS eliminated them periodically so that they could not testify. Those who served in those facilities knew it, and some decided to write. Zalman Lewenthal wrote in Polish and Yiddish. He buried his notebooks in a metal canteen near the pit where the bodies were burned. What he wrote was a chronicle of the horror from the inside: the arrivals of the transports, the march toward the underground changing rooms, the sound that came from the gas chambers, the subsequent work. The questions he asked himself, and which had no answer. I am the person who finds his work in memorializing the events and writings and in preserving the memory of the members of my family who perished. Salman Gradowski from Suwałki also wrote, his notebooks, found in 1944 and 1945 among the ruins of the crematorium, are an elegy to his family, his mother, his sister, his wife, all gassed upon arrival. Gradowski described the trains that arrived with transport after transport, the families separated on the platform, the children who did not understand what was occurring, the elderly who could no longer walk. He wrote knowing that he would die and that perhaps no one would ever read what he had written. He wrote it anyway. Leib Langfuss was another member of the Sonderkommando who buried his notes. His manuscript was discovered in 1962 in the vicinity of the ruins of Crematorium 5. The manuscripts were found at different dates: 1945, 1952, 1962, 1970, 1980. The last known one was unearthed in 1980. Nobody knows if there are more. The earth of Birkenau may still guard voices that have not been heard. These documents are unique in the history of the genocide, written testimonies from the center of the machinery of extermination by those who operated it under coercion. There is no other comparable source to understand what occurred in the interior of the crematoria. And their staggered discovery over decades was a constant reminder that Auschwitz was not a closed place, a concluded chapter. It was a place that kept revealing its secrets. Detailed knowledge about the scale and functioning of Auschwitz did not emerge all at once in January 1945. It was laboriously constructed over decades through trials, academic research, testimonies, and the gradual opening of archives. The first data came from the survivors themselves and from the documents found in the camp. The SS had destroyed many records, but not all. The camp registration books, the correspondence between the Zentralbauleitung and the Topf und Söhne construction company, manufacturer of the crematoria furnaces, the delivery notes for Zyklon B, the production reports of IG Farben, all of this remained. The Soviets captured them and guarded them in their archives for decades. It was Rudolf Höss who, in his testimonies at Nuremberg and in his memoirs written in the Polish prison, provided the first detailed reconstruction of the camp's functioning from the perpetrator's point of view. His data, although imprecise in some aspects, confirmed the scale of the extermination and the chain of command. It remains the most cited primary source on the internal functioning of the camp. In the 50s and 60s, academic research on the Holocaust was scarce, not because the sources did not exist, but because there were cultural resistances to confronting the facts in their full extension. In Germany, the perpetrator country, the topic was an almost total taboo during the first post-war years. In Israel, the new state was more interested in building a future than in dwelling in the past. In Poland, the communist narrative minimized the Jewish component of the crime. In the Western world, the Cold War dominated all priorities. The Eichmann trial in 1961 was a turning point. The global television coverage, the testimony of dozens of survivors, the meticulousness with which the Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner built the case turned the genocide into a documented fact before the consciousness of millions of people who had never paid attention to the details. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who attended the trial as a correspondent for the New Yorker magazine, wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, which introduced the concept of the banality of evil. The idea that the genocide was not the work of exceptional monsters, but of mediocre officials who simply did their job without questioning the meaning of what they were doing. Höss, Groening, Eichmann. Men without particular greatness, without visible psychopathology, integrated into a structure that transformed bureaucracy into extermination. The historiography of Auschwitz continued to develop during the following decades. The State Museum began to publish systematic research. Oral testimonies were gathered and archived, first on a small scale and then, starting in the 80s and 90s, in massive projects like the USC Shoah Foundation Institute, founded by Steven Spielberg in 1994 following the filming of Schindler's List, which came to compile more than 55,000 testimonies recorded on video. The opening of the Soviet archives after 1991 added thousands of documents that had been inaccessible for decades, including correspondence and materials from the SS's own archives captured by the Red Army in 1945 and transferred to Moscow. The most rigorous research on the total number of victims was conducted by the historian Franciszek Piper of the State Museum in the 80s. His study, published in 1991, established that the number of people murdered in Auschwitz was approximately 1.1 million, not the 4 million of the Soviet sign, of whom between 900,000 and 1 million were Jews. That figure is today the one accepted by the international historiographical community and by the museum itself. The dispute over numbers was utilized systematically by Holocaust deniers. If the figures had dropped from 4 to 1, they said, the next step was to keep reducing them until total denial. The argument was dishonest. The correction of the politically motivated, inflated Soviet figure toward the more precise number was not a concession to denial, but the result of rigorous historiographical work that all deniers claimed was not being done. Of the approximately 100,000 owners of property stolen during the Holocaust or their heirs who presented claims for restitution in Europe after the war, the proportion that obtained full compensation was marginal. In the Eastern European countries that had passed into the Soviet sphere, restitution was structurally impossible. The nationalization of private property under communist regimes turned individual claims into illusions. The houses confiscated from deported Jews had been assigned to new tenants who paid rent to the state. When surviving families returned to ask for their houses, the response was that the state was the owner. There was no one to negotiate with. In West Germany, the government of Konrad Adenauer signed the Luxembourg Agreement in 1952 with the State of Israel. Germany would pay Israel 3 billion marks, and the Claims Conference, an organization representing Jewish victims, 450 million marks distributed over 12 years. The payments began in 1953 and were completed in 1965. They were a material base that contributed to the economic development of Israel in its first years of existence. But critics pointed out that the deal was between states, not between individual victims and their victimizers. Many survivors never received anything directly. The following decade saw intermittent disputes over specific properties, over bank accounts in Switzerland, over life insurance, over works of art. Many of those cases were not resolved until the 90s or later. Swiss financial institutions reached an agreement in 1998 with the Volcker Commission to return $1.250 billion corresponding to unclaimed accounts of Holocaust victims. German banks reached agreements of their own. Germans who, like Groening, had provided service in Auschwitz in functions not directly executing began to be prosecuted belatedly. Oskar Groening himself was tried in Lüneburg in 2015 at 93 years of age and condemned to 4 years in prison for complicity in the murder of at least 300,000 people. He died in 2017 before serving his sentence. The question of what constitutes sufficient justice for crimes of that scale has no satisfactory answer. The survivors who were still living when Groening was condemned in 2015 knew that the sentence was symbolic. Eva Moses Kor, who had survived Mengelé's experiments and who was a witness in that trial, shook the defendant's hand in the courtroom and declared publicly that she forgave him. The decision was highly controversial among other survivors and in Jewish communities. Some considered that individual forgiveness to a perpetrator was a betrayal to the victims who could not speak. Eva Kor insisted that forgiveness was not a gift for Groening, but a way to free herself from the weight of hatred. She died in July 2019. Approximately 2 million people visit Auschwitz-Birkenau each year. In 2019, before the pandemic, the figure reached 2.3 million, the highest since the opening of the museum. The main camp, Auschwitz I, preserves its original brick buildings, the sign Arbeit macht frei over the entrance gate, a replica since 2009, when the original was stolen and subsequently recovered, Block 11 with its Wall of Death, the gas room of Crematorium 1. The barracks contain permanent exhibitions with thousands of objects, 80,000 shoes of the victims, 3,800 suitcases with names and addresses written, tufts of hair preserved in glass cases, cans of Zyklon B Birkenau 3 kilometers away is another experience. It is a space of monumental scale, 175 hectares. The ruins of crematoria 2, 3, 4 and 5 are visible, covered with grass or invaded by stagnant water in the basements. The brick barracks that survived the post-war looting remain standing, with their original wooden bunks and the narrow skylight that was the only source of light. The International Monument of 1967, with its plaques in 20 languages, flanks the train track that enters directly into the camp. The conversation over what to do with that space does not end. The original materials deteriorate, wood rots, brick disintegrates, the victim's objects fragment. Conservation requires difficult decisions. To what extent to intervene to preserve without altering? How to protect the ruins of the crematoria without converting them into reconstructions that betray their character as authentic vestiges? How to design the visit so that millions of people can comprehend what occurred without the scale of tour groups trivializing the place? The museum publishes strict behavior guides for visitors. Eating inside the enclosure is not permitted. Photography of the victim's personal objects is not permitted in some areas. The guides have specific training in history and in the pedagogy of genocide, but the most difficult challenge is not logistical. It is pedagogical. January 27th has been designated by the United Nations as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The date coincides with the liberation of the camp in 1945. Each year, representatives from dozens of countries, survivors, fewer and fewer, and older, heads of state gather in Birkenau. The last major commemoration with a significant number of survivors was the 75th anniversary in January 2020. The number of direct witnesses remaining is already in the dozens, not hundreds. That transition, from lived memory to transmitted memory, is the central challenge of 21st century Auschwitz. When the last survivor dies, the camp will depend entirely on records, objects, recorded testimonies, and buildings that deteriorate. The weight of keeping the memory alive will fall upon generations that knew no one who had been there. There are people who say it did not occur, that the gas chambers are a fabrication, that the numbers are exaggerated, that the Holocaust is a lie. Holocaust denial, as an organized current, was not born in the 70s, although it was then that it acquired its most structured form, with pseudo-academic publications like those of the Institute for Historical Review, founded in California in 1978 by Willis Carto and William David McCalden. Their arguments are always the same. Zyklon B gas was a disinfectant, the numbers are inflated, the documents are false, the witnesses lie or are mistaken. Denialist arguments have a peculiar characteristic. They are not scientifically refutable for whoever has decided not to believe in the evidence. Because when the evidence is overwhelming, and it is in Auschwitz more than in any other place, the denier simply says that all of it is false. It is a closed system. What denial needs to prosper is the time that separates the facts from their direct witnesses. The more time passes, the easier it becomes to insinuate doubts about what no one who is alive can refute firsthand. This is the reason why historians, museums, memory institutions insist on rigorous documentation, not as an abstract academic practice, but as an active resistance against future manipulation. Oskar Groening, the SS official who sorted the money stolen from the deportees and whom we described before, decided to speak publicly for exactly that reason. It bothered him that people he crossed paths with at his philately club told him that what he himself had seen was impossible. In an interview for the BBC, he directed his message directly to those who denied it. I saw the gas chambers, I saw the crematorium, I saw the fires in the open air. I was on the ramp during the selections. I would like you to believe that these atrocities occurred because I was there. A confessed perpetrator, confirming the crime of which he had formed part as a last bulwark against denial. But distortion does not come only from declared deniers. It comes also from relativization, from whataboutism, what about the others, from the appropriation of trauma for political ends, from the instrumentalization of Auschwitz in debates over contemporary conflicts. When the name of the camp is used as a rhetorical weapon in disputes that have nothing to do with the systematic extermination of 6 million European Jews, a form of distortion also occurs. One that, unlike open denial, is much more difficult to name and combat. In the year 2000, Eva Mozes Kor returned to Auschwitz. She was 56 years old. She had founded an organization called Candles, Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiment Survivors, alongside other survivors of Mengele's experiments. She dedicated herself to educating, bearing witness, processing in public what had occurred to her. When they asked her how she had survived being a 10-year-old girl, she responded that she had survived by determination. I promised myself that I would live one more week, then another week, and another. Her twin sister Miriam survived the camp but died in 1993 of a kidney cancer that, according to doctors, was a direct consequence of the experiments to which they had subjected her in Auschwitz. Miriam's kidneys had never fully matured. The experiments damaged them permanently. She died 48 years after the liberation because of the camp. Primo Levi wrote in If This Is a Man, finished in 1946, that the camp had produced in its survivors a shame that had no name in the language of those who had not been there, the shame of having survived when others could not, the shame of the moments when, to survive, they had had to depart from what they considered their values, the shame of having been witnesses without being able to act. It was not guilt in the legal sense of the term. It was something deeper and more confusing, the moral contamination that the camp imposed upon everyone who passed through it, including its victims. Elie Wiesel, who arrived in Birkenau from Sighetu Marmației in Romania in May 1944 at 16 years of age, spent the rest of his life being a public witness of what occurred. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. In his acceptance speech, he said, "The messenger stalks his enemy, and you cannot not listen." Wiesel did not believe in silence. He believed that silence was complicity, and he dedicated decades to speaking, to writing, to pressuring world leaders regarding genocides that were occurring while the world looked the other way. Wiesel died in July 2016. He had survived Auschwitz, Buchenwald, the Death March. He had survived the shame and the silence of the first post-war years. He had lived to see the camp converted into a museum, then into a UNESCO World Heritage Site, then into a symbol that the entire world recognized, although did not always comprehend. But until the end of his life, he maintained that no full comprehension was possible, that Auschwitz was, in some dimension, incomprehensible, not as a shield to avoid thinking about it, but as an honest acknowledgement that the scale of the crime exceeded any available conceptual framework. The winter of 1945 left Auschwitz as a landscape of ruins in the snow. The crematoria dynamited, the wires rusted, the wooden barracks that the Polish wind began to rot, and the thousands of people who had survived scattered across a Europe that in many cases did not want them back. 80 years later, the camp is a museum. It is a site of pilgrimage. It is a wound in the landscape of human consciousness that does not finish closing. The numbers are dizzying: 1.1 million dead, of whom around 1 million were Jews. Deported from all over Europe, 438,000 from Hungary, 300,000 from Poland, 69,000 from France, 60,000 from the Netherlands, 55,000 from Greece, 46,000 from Czechoslovakia, plus the 70,000 Polish political prisoners, the 21,000 gypsies, the 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, the hundreds of Jehovah's Witnesses, the homosexuals, those sent for reasons that never made sense. Of the 6,500 SS members who served in the camp and survived the war, around 85% were never prosecuted. Josef Mengele died in a Brazilian river in 1979 without having passed through any court. The engineers who designed the crematoria furnaces were mostly acquitted or never tried. The judicial system of the world was not designed for crimes of that scale, and political wills did not help either. The camp survived. It was preserved, studied, debated, instrumentalized, venerated, and desecrated. Its ruins remain there, covered with grass in summer, with snow in winter. The last survivor still alive will die at some point in the coming years. After that, what historians and the museum have constructed will remain: records, objects, recorded testimonies, buildings in a process of degradation that money and human effort try to keep standing. The question that Auschwitz poses has not changed since 1945. It was formulated in different ways by Primo Levi, by Elie Wiesel, by Hannah Arendt, by the philosophers who tried to think with what had occurred. What is a human being capable of doing to another human being when institutional restrictions disappear, when ideology authorizes it, when bureaucracy organizes it, and fear sustains it? The answer that Auschwitz gives to that question is not comforting, and that discomfort, that refusal of the camp to offer easy consolation, is perhaps the most important thing it has to teach. Eva Moses Kor, the 10-year-old girl who in January 1945 broke the ice of the Sola River to drink, who looked to the other side of the river and saw a girl with ribbons in her hair going to school, and who that day understood for the first time that a world existed beyond, kept returning to Auschwitz for decades. She returned to speak with visitors, to shake the hands of perpetrators who agreed to meet with her, to declare time and again, in schools and universities all over the world, what she had seen and what she had survived. She died on July 4, 2019. She was 85 years old. Her sister Miriam had died 26 years earlier because of the wounds that Auschwitz left in her kidneys. The camp remains there.